Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Sam.
I'm Billi.
After 15 months of devastating conflict, Israel and Hamas have agreed to a ceasefire-hostage deal, marking a major turning point in the war. The agreement, brokered by Egyptian, Qatari and US authorities, is set to begin this Sunday. In today's deep dive, we're going to break down what this means for the region and the prospects for lasting peace.
Sam, this was huge news that we in Australia woke up to yesterday, that the conflict that has claimed tens of thousands of lives is finally, well, hopefully over. Do you want to start by just reminding us how we got here and how this latest bout of fighting started?
Well, we go back 15 months and the current phase of the conflict began on the 7th of October 2023. That was the day that Hamas launched an attack on Israel, killing around 1,200 people. They also took 251 hostages, with about 100 of those still being held in Gaza. Israel responded by declaring war on Hamas and launching a military campaign in Gaza. The human toll of that campaign has been devastating. UN data shows around 46,600 Palestinians have been killed, and at least 90% of Gaza's population is now displaced. The territory is facing what the UN has called one of the worst humanitarian crises in recent history.
And now we have this deal that has been announced. Do you want to walk us through what it actually involves?
Yeah, and the first thing I want to say is that we haven't actually seen the full text of this deal. It hasn't been made public so far. We're going off the widely reported details that stems from some news organizations having a copy themselves. The Associated Press was the first news company to have a copy of the deal. With that said, we do have a firm idea of what's entailed. We also got some confirmation from the US President, Joe Biden, and Qatar's Prime Minister during a number of press conferences yesterday. So it's structured in three parts. The first phase, which will start on Sunday, so in 48 hours' time, is going to last 6 weeks. And during that time, there will be a complete ceasefire and Hamas will release 33 hostages. Now, in exchange of those hostages, Israel will release hundreds of Palestinian prisoners, including 30 who are currently serving life sentences. And what's really significant is that the IDF will need to pull back from populated areas in Gaza during this period, and they're going to retreat to a buffer zone near the Israeli border. And that should allow more humanitarian aid to enter Gaza and give displaced Palestinian civilians a chance to return to northern Gaza. Keep in mind, though, that US research has indicated that about 60% of buildings in Gaza have been destroyed over the past 15 months. Now, in terms of aid, the deal specifies 600 UN humanitarian trucks can enter each day, which is a marked increase from what's currently allowed to enter the Strip. Officials have said delivering aid could still be difficult due to Israel's restrictions on some UN agencies like UNRWA and widespread looting.
And by ceasefire, will there be a complete stop to the fighting?
Yeah, so think about ceasefire as both sides agreeing to stop fighting while officials negotiate the terms of a permanent truce. And I often find that that's the key to understanding the difference. Is it a ceasefire or is it a truce? And it's a really important distinction when we get to phase 2 and phase 3. And that's when a more permanent solution to this is trying to be worked out. One more point before I move on to talking about phases 2 and 3. The deal's only going to come in on Sunday, and a few hours after the deal was announced yesterday, the IDF launched another round of strikes in northern Gaza, killing at least 12. And I think that goes to something I want to talk to you about at the end, Billi, which is that this is a framework where a lot can go wrong as well.
So for the next 48 hours, there won't be that immediate stop in fighting, but after Sunday.
Exactly. So it's going to come into force on Sunday, or at least that's the plan for now.
And so you've taken us through the first phase. I'm interested, you said that they're still kind of working out phase 2 and 3. Is that right,
Yeah.
that they haven't fully agreed on what those phases will look like yet?
Yeah, and it's not uncommon in these sorts of ceasefires historically for this to be the way that these fold out. I mean, one way to think about the stages is that phase 1 is the stage that allows officials to think about how to execute stages 2 and 3.
But we do still know some things about stage 2 and 3, right?
Yeah, we know the goal of phases 2 and 3 is for, as Joe Biden said, a permanent end to the war. And that's all going to depend, though, on how the first 6 weeks of phase 1 pan out. If it pans out well, in phase 2, Hamas would release all remaining living hostages in exchange for more Palestinian prisoners and a complete IDF withdrawal from Gaza. Joe Biden said, though, that if the negotiations to get to a phase 2 go longer than the 6 weeks they've allocated for phase 1, that the phase 1 conditions are going to kind of remain in place for that. So they're hoping for 6 weeks. There's a 6-week countdown, but it can go longer. But I think the really tricky part to all of this is what happens after the IDF withdraws. And I think that's why it's taking officials a bit of time, is much of the negotiations in this part of the deal is going to relate to how the long-term reconstruction and permanent peace is actually going to be built in Gaza. A big focus of this is also going to be who's going to govern Gaza in the long term. And then if we move past that, we get to a phase 3, and that's where the remains of any hostages who have been killed and are still held by Hamas would be exchanged for the implementation of what they're calling a multi-year reconstruction plan in Gaza, and that would be administered by an international coalition.
And all of those questions that you're bringing up about kind of what the long-term future of Gaza is and this war between Israel and Hamas, I guess it's important to say that this is in the context of a really long-term war. These are not new questions. They're questions that the region has and the country has been dealing with for decades and decades. So it will be fascinating to see if, like you said, this is a long-term solution that will potentially put an end to those decades of fighting, rather than just seeing this as something that has happened in the last 15 months.
Definitely. And even listening to some of the responses from other Middle Eastern countries' leadership yesterday, there was this real sense of, for such a dynamic and troubled region, whether this type of event would lead to more sustained peace. You're totally right. This is a part of the world that really, really speaking, for hundreds of years has not been in what we would describe as peacetime.
So this was all announced early yesterday in Australia. What happens now?
Hi, I'm Ola.
And I'm Elliot.
We're the two-person team behind everything video and audio here at the Daily Aus.
If you want to help us grow so we can deliver more of the content that you love, be sure to hit subscribe.
Now let's get back to the video.
So the plan is with Israel's cabinet, and that is a body in Israel that includes the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and his senior ministers. They'll have final approval over all the details of the plans. We're talking maps, we're talking names of prisoners and hostages, before the plan is actually implemented on Sunday.
And what has the response been from the leaders of Israel and Hamas?
So Israeli President Isaac Herzog yesterday urged the cabinet to accept the deal. He said that the deal would bring our sons and daughters home. In a statement from Hamas said the deal was an achievement for our people, our resistance, our nation, and the free people of the world. It marks a crucial turning point in the struggle against the enemy on the path to achieving our people's goals of liberation and return.
And when talking about the response, I saw a lot of videos yesterday on social media of people in Gaza and also in Israel really celebrating this agreement and hopefully celebrating the end to what has been, like you said, 15 months of complete devastation.
And I think that's another pattern that emerges from these sorts of moments. I'm thinking about, ceasefires being reached in places like Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan over the last 20 years. The relief and the outpouring of emotion that we often see on the streets of these countries
for the civilians
is quite overwhelming. At the end of the day, these sorts of political decisions actually have real life impacts to both Israelis and Palestinians.
And US President Joe Biden also held a press conference yesterday. He stood up with Vice President Kamala Harris and the Secretary of State Antony Blinken to announce the deal. What did he say?
So he got up, he announced the deal, and he said this.
More than 15 months of terror for the hostages, their families, the Israeli people. More than 15 months of suffering by the innocent people of Gaza. Fighting in Gaza will stop, and soon the hostages will return home to their families.
Now, Biden wasn't the only US president we heard from yesterday. We also heard from President-elect Donald Trump. Now, he had previously said there would be, quote, hell to pay if the hostages weren't released by his inauguration, which is January 20, also only a few days away. After the deal was announced, he claimed on Truth Social that his incoming administration had, quote, achieved so much without even being in the White House.
Yeah, there's an interesting US political angle here too, because both Joe Biden and Donald Trump are kind of fighting over who can claim credit for negotiating this deal.
Definitely. And I mean, Biden is coming out and saying this is the exact wording of the deal that he put to the parties in May last year. Trump is saying the deal is only happening because of his imminent arrival at the White House. There was also this really interesting moment at the end of the press conference yesterday where Biden was asked who could take credit for the deal.
Thank you.
Books credit for this, Mr. President, you or Trump?
Is that a joke? Oh, thank you.
I do think there's a lot of kind of political noise and spin when we work out who can take the credit for this. And there were many comments not only from Biden and Trump, but also from Blinken and other representatives of the actual team of US officials who have been negotiating this deal. And one thing that came through when you took away the comments from Biden and Trump is that it's been a combined effort, that there were comments about, the incoming administration and the Biden administration working, quote, as one team on the deal in recent weeks, which I thought was really interesting.
And quickly talk me through the Australian political response.
So a couple of hours after the news of the ceasefire broke, Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, he said the ceasefire is a, quote, new chapter for the Israeli and Palestinian people.
This agreement is a constructive step towards peace and stability in the region. We hope it will allow the Palestinian people the opportunity to rebuild, reform their governance, which is most necessary, and pursue self-determination. Australia remains unequivocal in our condemnation of Hamas's atrocities on the 7th of October.
We also heard yesterday from the opposition leader, Peter Dutton. He welcomed the deal, saying Australia should now seek to re-establish its important relationship with Israel.
And to finish up, we did briefly touch on this, but I want to bring it up again because I think the big question that everyone has is around whether the ceasefire deal can actually last long term. What do you think?
I think this is an incredibly tough question to answer, but I do think that we need to think about this deal not just in the 6 weeks of phase 1, but this is a 3-phase deal, and both parties need to pass the test of phase 1 to get to phase 2 and then phase 3. Agreements like this are never guaranteed, and they're so fragile. I mean, you think about one missile going from Gaza to Israel or one rocket going from Israel to Gaza, and all of a sudden the deal is off. But whilst they do sometimes fall down, they do have the capacity to usher in a new period of peace. And that doesn't matter where it is in the world. We know that over history, ceasefires can work. It's fragile. It may fail at any time, but it also might work. And I think a really critical point for us to be looking out for is that 6-week point at the end of phase 1. Negotiators essentially have this 6-week countdown ahead of them. If they do work out a framework to enter phase 2, then they'll have momentum and they'll have a drive forward. If you start extending phase 1, that's where we might see some of the fighting resume.
We'll be watching closely as this deal unfolds on Sunday. Thank you, Sam, for taking us through it.
Thanks, Billy.
And thank you for listening to this episode of The Daily Aus. We'll be back this afternoon with your afternoon headlines, but until then, have a great weekend.